Hey, how's it going, everyone? Thank you for joining me on a new episode of the Music Reviewer Podcast. My name's Josh, and thanks for tuning in to this episode of the album review series. This is going to be episode 43. The title of the album is Man on the Moon 3, released on December 11th by Kid Cudi. And yeah, pretty interesting album. Probably an interesting review since this is an album I'm sort of lukewarm on. I've never really delved into Kid Cudi's work, but to just build on top of that, the main reason why this album's being covered is because if you're familiar with Best and Worst Track of the Week, our weekly review series where we cover tracks that make it onto the Billboard Hot 100 and review each track, well, it's a super busy week. Upcoming. This episode of Best and Worst Track of the Week will drop quite soon after this review. And we got two album bombs, one of which being this album, Man on the Moon 3, which a lot of the tracks did drop onto the Billboard Hot 100. Not all of them, but the big one was Taylor Swift's Evermore, which literally every song dropped on that week. So, yeah, basically the review for Best and Worst Track of the Week and basically Taylor Swift's album, Evermore, is going to be covered on Best and Worst Track of the Week this week. So if you are wanting a review of that album, check out Best and Worst Track of the Week. But yeah, I'm doing this review mainly to condense that episode slightly. But nonetheless, happy I covered this album, and I'm happy to now be a little bit more versed in Kid Cudi's music, but he does have a vast discography. But anyways, just before we get started, I also want to plug in there that the last album review that dropped, it's been some time, was actually Miley Cyrus's Plastic Hearts. If you're interested in her album, check it out, but also check out that review. Had quite a few thoughts on that album overall. I thought it was quite good for the most part, not excellent. And then also the latest Best and Worst Track of the Week from last week, the week of December 19th, if you're interested in it. Lots of Christmas music featured overall in that chart, but basically it was Lil Baby versus the Kid Laroi. So some interesting songs covered in that week as well. Also, one more thing. Between now and then, last week's Best and Worst Track of the Week, I dropped a YouTube-only Christmas-themed video where I covered a list of new Christmas music songs, and I ranked them in my own opinion from a list from GQ magazine, randomly. But yeah, it was kind of a fun episode I did. I want to do more YouTube-only stuff that's kind of just more off the script, kind of just free-flowing ideas. But yeah, if you have not familiarized with the YouTube channel, please go like and subscribe there if you've been listening to this podcast. I will link the video in the episode description as well to that Christmas episode. But nonetheless, yeah, sort of building on Christmas. It is late Christmas night, I guess. Not Christmas Eve, but the night of Christmas. Technically after midnight, so December 26th that I'm recording this. But anyways, let's go ahead and get into this album review. So like I said earlier, this episode's going to be covering Man on the Moon 3 from the artist Kid Cudi, a very interesting artist at that. This is the third installment of the Man on the Moon, saga. There are two previous Man on the Moon albums, but they're certainly not the only music Kid Cudi has ever dropped. And just to go over Kid Cudi a little bit, some of his backstory. Kid Cudi is an American singer, songwriter, rapper, record producer, and record executive. Even according to Wikipedia, he's an actor. He has some acting credits, so I thought that was pretty interesting as well. Starting all the way back in 2008, he dropped a mixtape titled A Kid Named Cudi, which caught the attention of Kanye West and led him to be signed to Kanye's label, Good Music. And I believe I read up a little bit more on his biography. He's from Ohio, I believe, but he sort of had an interesting upbringing. His mother was a choir teacher, and he lost his father quite early on in life. So, not saying I know everything about it, but his life, but you can kind of see later on how dark his music is. Probably stems somewhere from, that childhood he had. And I think he ended up moving to New York to pursue a music career. And that's eventually what sparked the career when Day and Night came out. A single from that said mixtape, which definitely lit the upward trajectory of his career. And the track was a worldwide hit. I remember being alive around that time. That track was special. Anyone that was, I guess, listening to hip hop radio at that time, or even pop radio, had heard it. And I can recall the significance the song had on my generation as well. Being in high school at the time, I think I just had entered high school. The track featured a dark and moody aesthetic that wasn't all that common in rap at the time. I remember around that time we were sort of getting out of the bling era, or we were sort of in the midst of the bling era. Lil Wayne's career was definitely at its height. And for someone like me that was a lukewarm rap listener at the time, I gravitated towards the track, and I was a fan of, the music. And I guess I was interested in Kid Cudi, but I never enough to really delve into his discography. I'll get more into that later. But overall, I liked how simple the track was compositionally, and while also being completely unique to the artist. I'd never really heard anything like Day and Night until I heard Kid Cudi do his thing. Soon after that, in 2009, Man on the Moon 1 was released, which went to go on double platinum eventually, so it's hugely successful commercially. The album was especially significant at the time to many people I grew up with. Also, I remember tons of kids I interacted with, and even some friends and acquaintances were quite avid Kid Cudi proponents and listeners, and it definitely was a thing to listen to Kid Cudi. And I believe that was the start of Kid Cudi's massive cult following that till this day unquestionably supports him. There are some diehard Kid Cudi fans out there. And unfortunately, me being the indie rock snob I was between my sophomore and junior year, maybe into my senior year as well, I never really bought into the hype. Regrettingly, I still have not listened to Man on the Moon 1 from front to back, or really any of Kid Cudi's albums to this day, until now reviewing this music. And yeah, it's a character flaw of mine. And unfortunately, the notorious Speeding Bullet to Heaven came out in the midst of my college years, and the notorious reception and the needle drop review that gave it, I think, a 0 during that time didn't encourage me to take the prospect of listening to him more seriously. I swear I always meant to get around to it, but I'm just a really huge procrastinator. And I'm happy to use this review as an opportunity to get more familiar with the discography. And as usual, if you're familiar with my reviews, I usually like to go back to the most recent project, his most recent solo effort, specifically because he has had some collab albums, the Kids See Ghost project being one of them since then. And I will use that as well as a side note. Kids See Ghost, the collab with Kanye West, has been regarded as one of the, best rap projects of the 2010s. I don't think I'm that sold on it, but I do like the project overall. But I wouldn't really quite say it's something that really matters in the context of Man in the Moon 3. I don't really hear much of the music from Kids See Ghosts on this album. But yeah, I like doing this to see how he has progressed since then, and also just what he was doing in 2016 when the album Passion, Pain, and Demon Slaying came out. I was not expecting what I heard on that album. First of all, it's not really a hip-hop album. The album appears to be quite experimental. Tracks like Releaser don't appear to resemble anything of a hip-hop song. Much rather like a Portishead track maybe. By design, the track had a similar issue as well. However, the feature did bring some rapping to the table. Whoever that artist is on that track, he shows up a couple times on the album. He's nice. I guess he's like Sean Paul almost, like, if you will. So I guess the point wasn't really to be a hip hop album in Pain and Demon Slain. And also more on the album. Pharrell's feature on Flight at First Sight Advanced was pretty good. I enjoyed it. Also, there were some confusing moments, like what the hell was going on Dance for Eternity. And then towards the latter part of the album, I really felt like it was a chore to get through it. I did find, though, in tracks like Cosmic Warrior, the instrumentals were pretty interesting and good compositionally. There were some flashes of greatness throughout the album, but overall, I would not consider the project to be that good. It was really tough listening to it. I think Cudi was just, there's some parts in lyrically where there was a lot of slurs and undiscernible lines, and I felt like the project really just wasn't self-aware. Like, he was just going very much into like his head, but maybe no one else bothered to tell him that some of that album needed some trimming, because a lot of the things really sounded like B-sides or, just unfinished concepts on a lot of those tracks, especially in the latter half of that album. But yeah, this review isn't about that album, but I would say Man on the Moon 3 is a significant improvement. It feels more like an actual concise hip-hop album with some, added experimentation as well. There are the classic signature Kid Cudi mannerisms, if you will, like the moaning vocalizations that sound like moos from a cow. They're there. You get that immediately on the opening track, Beautiful Trip, which is kind of like a prelude with some Zen vibe going on the instrumentation and the overall soundscape. It's a nice, opening moment. But we do transition quickly into the gist of the album on Tequila Shots, which I didn't find to be that much of a highlight. I will say immediately here we get an overall theme of like some Travis Scott influence, where he's blatantly taking a lot of his mannerisms as well. But I guess you could argue, I know they collabed before, they're probably friends. Maybe Kid Cudi is responsible for Kid Travis Scott's music being the way it is. But I really see it more of the opposite. I really feel like he's just straight up taking from Travis Scott on a lot of moments. And this album does have some of that. Or this track specifically, Tequila Shots. I didn't find this track to be that significant in the grand scope of the album. But I will say the next track, Another Day, is a significant improvement. There's a dramatic introduction here. I do like some of the dry percussive textures in the beat. Obviously, if you listen to it, there's some more Travis Scott influence, especially in the ad-lib. Kid Cudi does dig into his deeper vocal register a bit better than on other music I've heard from him, especially in this context. It just works. And I like the mechanical nature of this track as well. It's a lot more interesting than the nature of the previous track. And the track definitely keeps a consistent level of energy as well. Although the track doesn't really try to build up to a climax, I'll say that. But the track definitely keeps a consistent groove. There's even an interesting outro as well on this. The next track, She Knows This, is another good track on this album. I like the pluck instrumental sample thing on here. There's a nice and bouncy beat that gives the track a lot of energy. It's by far has the most energy thus far on the album. An uncomfortable whistle thing thrown in on the track that creates a really cool effect. I kind of didn't notice it until like my second or third listen. And the track doesn't try to do too much as well. I'd say that's a good thing, because sometimes I think the faults of some of Cudi's music is that he just tries to do too much. And then there's a lovely transition to this faster beat switch. The song definitely improves at that time. But here we get some really, really, really obvious, like, Travis Scott ripoff, where it kind of just sounds like a variation of Sicko Mode. I had to really look up on the credits if Travis Scott was actually featured on here. It sounds like a straight up feature. But I love the instrumental here, the lovely synth ostinato melodies that like glide over this section. They're one of the best moments on this album. The track has a nice intense build up in the latter portion of the track, and it's, in my opinion, the best song thus far on here, probably the whole album. The next track was interesting as well, Dive. Here we get a down-tempo introduction, very spacey and synthy, some ethereal nature as well. A nice rhythmic flow on Cudi's part. I like the accented moments on his vocal lines. Although the song content is interesting, it kind of follows a theme with self-deprecation and kind of like touching on alcoholism. Some interesting and chaotic electronic elements on the track as well. I was kind of indifferent, but the more I listened to it, I liked the track more. The next track was interesting as well, Damaged. Here I feel like we get some obvious Travis Scott influence here as well, with some wailing autotune vocalizations and similar ad-libs, some interesting synthy elements that color the track nicely. There's a held out and reverby snare hit throughout the track that's a little distracting, and there is tension created in the chorus, and that's kind of what I like about this track. It's probably the best part of the track. But the vocals, I think, immediately just struck me as goofy. They just sound a little bit uncomfortable or just, I guess, corny at times. Even his performances on the verses sound a little bit robotic and undynamic at times too, but I kind of like the dark nature of this track overall, so I did enjoy it. The next track, Heaven on Earth, I didn't quite find to be that much of a highlight. I like this sort of demonic color that's on Cudi's voice at times, I think in the second verse, but the track does lose a bit of steam towards the latter half. But there are some vocal shouts that Cudi does to make the track a little bit more interesting. The next track I wasn't super sold on, Show Out with Skepta and Pop Smoke, but I did find it to be super interesting. And I do like what Skepta and Pop Smoke were doing on here. I like that Pop Smoke was on the hook of this track. It felt like it's something that could have made his last posthumous album. The drill beat's solid on here. Not bad in the context of the album too. I didn't mind hearing it. The bass hits sound huge. I will say Cudi sounds interesting in this context. He's not bad, but he's definitely not on the level of Skepta or Pop Smoke on this beat. He does throw in some more bland Travis Scott influence on here. The track doesn't really develop that progressively either as it could have. It just kind of continues to add on more Cudi flair, and it doesn't make the track better as it progresses, unfortunately. The next track, Solo Dolo Part 3, I found it to be quite nice as well. There's an ethereal nature on here, especially in the intro, just kind of like the prelude track in the opening of the album. A nice moment when the drum track enters as well. I like that there's some deep synth textures that are incorporated on this track, and the vocal timbre sounds really great on his voice here as well. But it's, lyrically, it looks like it's just another depressing and dark track about alcoholism, maybe, or just maybe his, addiction struggles in general. A nice flow from Cudi on some of his more rap sections. So when he actually does bring out the rap chops, he does a good job. And I also found this track to be interesting because it has a bit of like a chill wave nature to it, maybe some light washed out influence. Definitely one of the better tracks on this project as well. Sad People, couldn't really get into it. I didn't find it to be quite of a highlight, which is the next track. Some muddy production. Elsie's Baby Boy Flashback was probably the outlier on this album. I did not like it when I first heard it, and it didn't really grow on me, but I did kind of understand it the more I heard it. especially when you look into like the background of his childhood and how he incorporates this on the story of this song. It kind of, it makes me feel bad. And it's an interesting idea. It maybe sounds like it was going for an anthemic or maybe hymn-like nature on the track. The track also shifts to like this hazy exiting instrumental that is honestly an improvement, but it sounds like a completely different track. It's an interesting track. The next track, September 16th, was a highlight. I like the drum track on this and how it gives some character to the track overall. So there's a nice bouncy tempo here. Cudi's vocals featured on here are very dark and whimpering. Although the track does have a nice ethereal nature with some synth textures coating everything in like this hazy matter. The bridge on this track is a nice moment with some interesting colors all throughout. And I do like how different it sounds in comparison to the rest of the album. It's kind of busy in a good way. And I like how intricate that moment, specifically in the bridge, felt. The track overall is not bad. I will say the more I listened to it, it was a little slow. Not bad, though. The next track, The Void, seems like it had some potential to it for sure. Probably the most hookiest thing on the album, but the track drags a bit in my opinion. Didn't really find it to be that much of a highlight. The next track is pretty interesting, though. Loving Me, featuring Phoebe Bridgers. And for some reason, this was one of the tracks that didn't make the Hot 100, sadly. And I don't know. I would have been wrong on my prediction a couple weeks ago when Phoebe Bridgers somehow miraculously made the Hot 100 with a cover track of the Goo Dolls. But yeah, I would have been wrong if this somehow slipped in. But anyway, the track features some typical Cudi vocal croons, the mooing, if you will, in the intro. Nice drum track here. Definitely an energetic tempo that the track definitely needs. I like the sparkly and light synth elements in the track as well. There is a interesting bass guitar track I hear in the mix, but it is quite buried overall. I would have liked if it was just a little bit more audible. Phoebe fits in quite well on this track. She kind of doesn't do too much, but that's kind of her style, and I think it's an interesting collaboration. It's a good track in the context of the album. It's not bad. The next track, The Pale Moonlight. I found this track to have some flashes of greatness. I like the lushfulness of the track overall and how Cudi's vocal hums provide some harmonic structure to the track. I liked how that's utilized. But the track kind of just features another Travis Scott-like moments that sounds quite similar to something he would have exactly done in a track like this. The track isn't bad, but I didn't like it as much the more I listened to it, unfortunately. The next track I found to be quite interesting, Rockstar Nights with Trippy Red. When I saw this feature and I heard it, I'm kind of not surprised Trippy is featured here. Hearing him in the context of this track, I can kind of see how Cudi would maybe be an influence on him. He sounds a little mix too high overall. His rapping and singing sounds as if he has a stuffy nose as usual. It's just a mannerism of Trippy Red that just always annoys me. But it's one of the better features I've heard from him as well. His vocal lines are just a little bit more tolerable than on other tracks. I don't know if it's just the writing is just a little bit better. Kid Cudi sounds miles more suited for this track, which it is his song, but I don't know. It's just kind of day and night when he enters. The track has some interesting synth textures as well in the mix that sound pretty, fun. It's a mixture between bright and subtle. The instrumental on here is a little wimpy, I'd say, though. That's kind of what I don't like, how it's not as prominent, but you hear Trippy's every little minuscule thing about Trippy's vocals. And the latter half of this track is also an improvement. There's a lot less Trippy Red. Some nice spaciness on here. In my opinion, it ended up being one of the better tracks on the album. The next track, unfortunately, cannot say the same thing. For the Kids. I like that there's some return to some actual rapping, and it's nice hearing that. But the instrumental sounds a little small. I'm not sure why. The track features a glitchy synth introduction, a little 80s industrial sounding. And I like the more subdued nature of the pre-chorus on here and the anticipation that it creates. The track sticks out in a good way in the context of the album as well. There's some moments that give less and are more restrained, but that definitely helps makes the more pronounced moments have a greater effect, and that's kind of what I like about this track. I think it's just written quite well. But yeah, that is the, track by track review. I'm not sure really how to feel about this album because I've not been an avid Kid Cudi listener over the years, so from the stuff I have heard, like the full albums, I think I have listened to Speeding Bullet to Heaven. Obviously not a very good album. And then the previous one to this, which in my opinion isn't very good either. This is definitely an improvement. This is, in my opinion, a good album. There are some things that I wish could have made the chopping block. Some things did annoy me, like the blatant copycat Travis Scott mannerisms. I don't know if that was on the nose or meant to be ironic, if he was just having fun with it, but it kind of got old after a while. But there are some great highlights on here that I don't want to take away from the album. I really did dig tracks like She Knows This, even Show Out. I like the Skepta and Pop Smoke moments. Solo Dolo Part 3 grew on me. Compositionally, the chorus, though, in my opinion, sucks, and the singing isn't good as all. It just sounds goofy and corny. It's a bit of a static track as well. It doesn't really develop to anything, so it kind of just felt like this track wasn't needed in the album. And we're pretty much here at the end of the album. This is the last track after that, Lord I Know, which I actually found to be a really good track. There were just some inconsistencies, maybe compositionally, where I think some tracks dragged out for a little bit too long than they needed to, where they just didn't develop to anywhere. But for this being, a project from an artist I don't really listen too much of, I like the album, but I wouldn't say in the context of other hip-hop albums I reviewed this year that this is better. Like, I gave the last Run the Jewels album a 6. Now, I don't know if I went back to it, maybe I would rate it higher, but this album is definitely not on the level of that album, in my opinion. This is just my opinion. So, I don't know, I'm feeling somewhere around a 5 out of 10. Maybe if it just would have chopped off some of the, excess, or some of the compositions were just more developed or just concise, and maybe leave out some of the pointless Travis Scott influence, this album would be a lot better. But I think if you're a Kid Cudi fan, if you're part of his cult following, you're going to think this album's great. If you're a hip-hop fan, you might be a little bit confused because, in my opinion, Kid Cudi isn't really a hip-hop artist to the core. He's kind of more of like an experimental artist with a lot of influences, and I respect that a lot. But I think at the end of this day, this album just panders to the Kid Cudi fans and the people that wanted Man on the Moon Part 3. Hopefully, we get something from Cudi that just kind of builds off a lot of the positive things I saw on this album. I really think there's a lot of potential to be tapped into. But yeah, that's kind of just my 2 cents. But yeah, if you made it to the end of this episode, thanks for listening. My name is Josh. Tune in to some more episodes coming out. I'll be reviewing some more music. If you're subscribed on your respected streaming service, thank you. If you enjoyed this podcast, please do so as well. If you're on YouTube, like and subscribe. If you like this review, if you didn't, leave some feedback as well. But anyways, take care of yourselves. Have a good holiday for the remainder of the year, and I will see you guys later.